The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. Each year, approximately 20 million people are affected by digestive disorders in Canada, resulting in over 18 million sick days and accounting for roughly 10% of all hospitalizations. Get relief with Probiotic 3, the revolutionary formula to support gut health. Probiotic 3 provides the highly effective and clinically supported probiotic strains to inhibit the growth of pathogenic bacteria such as H. pylori, all while promoting the growth of beneficial bacteria. This formula also helps to normalize the inflammatory response, promote detoxification, and support the immune system. Get yours today at your local retailer or online at aor.ca or aor.us. Welcome to Supplementing Health. I am your host, Cassie Price, and today I am joined by Dr. Christina Bjornal. Christina is a naturopathic doctor, author, and speaker with a focus on regaining your mental health using a naturopathic approach. She is the co-founder of Natural Terrain, is an avid outdoors and exercise enthusiast, is a mother and an authority in the treatment of conditions such as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders, and eating disorders. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today, Christina.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, what sparked your initial interest in mental health?
So for myself, I've had a lot of struggles with my mental health. So really, it's been my own journey in regaining my mental health from things like anxiety, depression. I'm a suicide survivor. I've had an eating disorder, and also I have bipolar disorder type 1. So I've had a lot of struggles in the mental health realm. And it was really through my own journey to recovery that I realized, there's not a lot of people out here that, like, I had a hard time finding help for myself in the natural realm. So then I made a career change and here I am.
I think too, the stigma that's around mental health, which I know is starting to shift, but it really did, especially kind of leading up to the shift, really hinder people's ability to find the various treatments they need. I know one of my good friends, she also is bipolar, and she's had several struggles over the year. She's now at a
Mhm.
better spot, but it definitely took a lot of trials and tribulations and ups and downs to get there. So I think it's awesome that people like you who understand it firsthand are taking the time to really share your knowledge and spread the understanding that it doesn't have to be something you're ashamed of. It just has to be something you're willing to address and work on and understand better, right?
Yeah, I know exactly. I mean, it's taken me a long time to get over the stigma though. Like the stigma it's really changed a lot since I was diagnosed back in 1987. So it's been, 35 years almost. And back then there was zero conversation going on anywhere. It was hard to be you were hard pressed to find anybody talking about mental health or mental awareness. But, fast forward to today, we have there's so much discussion and conversation and movements, and that's wonderful. But I still think there's a piece that we are missing that we need to move the dial on, and that's action taking. Like, what are we actually doing to help people? And so for me, my big, contribution has been my book Beyond the Label. And but it took me still several years to have the courage to put that book out there, because up until then I was very private about the bipolar diagnosis. I was open about the eating disorder, anxiety, depression. Most people get that, but people don't understand these more, I'll put them in the more, how can I say it in a positive way? More complex, I guess. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. These are more challenging conditions to navigate. But the message I want people to get is just that you do not, there's other options for you other than pharmaceuticals is your only choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think eating disorders are one of those mental illnesses that aren't often thought of by the general public as necessarily a mental health condition, right? It's kind of thought of in a different context, yet approximately 1 million Canadians have been diagnosed with some sort of eating disorder. So, what are those different types of eating disorders and the symptoms that go along with them?
So if the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual is kind of the psychiatric Bible, so to speak. And in there, they classify all mental health conditions, including eating disorders. So there's 8 that you can find in there. So they're called, I'll just list them. So pica, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, rumination, avoidant restrictive eating disorder, and eating disorders not otherwise specified. And I'm going to add orthorexia because I that's just another term that's been floating around. And so each of those have their own set of symptoms. So I think instead of diving into each of those, maybe we'll just understand that they are all, what they have in common is some sense of restriction or um, around food, unhealthy eating habits, and they can start from a common place.
Okay, and so do food addictions count as eating disorders?
So technically, I'm going to say, from my perspective, yes, but from the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, I don't believe it's in there. Um,
Okay.
I don't believe it is, but they're always changing that, so who knows? It could be in there now. But from my perspective, I'm going to answer that as yes. I think it does count as an eating disorder, for sure, absolutely. But I just want to be careful that we don't sort of over label people, right?
Right.
So that's why my book is called Beyond the Label, because we want to look at what's behind the behaviors. So my story, I'll just touch on it quickly. So I had bulimia, but really what was behind that bulimia for me was, well, a couple of things. One thing I'll just touch on now that ties into this question around food addiction was this obsession in a sense with sugar and also stress management for me. So it was like a stress coping mechanism. I mean, some people smoke marijuana, some people drink alcohol. I overate a bunch of horrible food and then would purge it out, right? So not a healthy coping mechanism at all. But what happened after I stopped purging, I still binged, and that left me with this food addiction piece only, right? I was super addicted to sugar.
Right. Well, and I mean, it's easy to do, right? Because food is a necessity. So we're always, so much of our culture is centered around food. It's, you go out to eat with friends, or you go for coffee, or you go for,
Mhm.
you make family meals. And I think there's a positive aspect to that. Absolutely. I think it's great to have that community around it and whatnot. But if you do have that unhealthy relationship, it can really perpetuate the
That's
underlying issues that exist there, right?
exactly. I mean, that's right. You just hit the hammer on the nail. It's all about the relationship that you're having. Yeah.
And how much do you, from your perspective, think the media and these, Instagram perfect lives and that sort of stuff that we're exposed to day play into these eating disorders?
Big time. Absolutely. Huge. Play a huge role. I mean, one of the things for me, and I think anybody who struggles with any mental health condition, a key question that always is reflected upon is why? Why is this happening to me? Why am I like this? Why is this going on? And for the eating disorder piece, everybody, I'm sure, has a different, obviously, everyone has a different story and experience, but the media is not doing women any service, that's for sure. And one of the things that I, was really happy to see, gosh, I don't remember exactly when this was, but the Dove campaign with real women, real bodies, real images, right? And
Yeah.
that was very, I think, a great step. So I think the media is partly to blame if we're going to point fingers.
And we tend to hear more about eating disorders in women rather than men. Is it
Yep.
actually more prevalent in women, or is it just not talked about as much for men?
It's actually more prevalent in women, but it's both. It's both. The answer to the question is both. It's more prevalent in women and is not talked about as much in men. So there haven't been very many eating disorder studies that actually include men. So it's probably an answer that will change over time, but I think what we want to understand is that men absolutely do struggle as well. But it's right now it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, more, there was a study that was recently done on men and women ages 18 to 35, and of the participants, it was 4,000 women, pardon me, and approximately 2,000 men. And men were more likely to report overeating as a issue, whereas women were more likely to talk about a loss of control while eating. And women more about body checking and avoidance and binging and that kind of thing. But men, that was sort of their biggest struggle, was more the overeating piece of the puzzle. But I've had patients who have had men patients with anorexia as well. So
Okay, interesting. And so
yeah.
then eating patterns, they must factor into eating disorders as well, correct?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's interesting that you asked it as well, because I was thinking about this recently, because there's been more conversation in the last 2 years, I would say, about things like intermittent fasting and therapeutic fasting and just fasting in general. Is that what you mean when you ask eating patterns, or do you mean like yeah, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, sort of
Yeah,
like fasting, or, certain people make sure they eat the bulk of their meals at lunch rather than dinner, or things like that, right? Where they
right.
they really try and control the parameters around when and how they eat.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a slippery slope. And I think it comes down to the intention behind why you're doing what you're doing. There's lots of things people do in the name of, quote unquote health, that aren't actually healthy. Like over exercising is a classic example that feeds into eating disorders, right?
Right.
So, and you see that a lot, and that's what happened to me too, right? As soon as I had to stop purging, and I didn't deal with the eating disorder piece right away. There's so many other things to deal with my mental health, that sort of took a side step. But what I did to compensate for, the stress and the half a cake I would eat, I would go run 10 miles the next day, right? Until somebody pointed out to me, hey, Chris, why are you doing all these, elite athlete things, ultimate, marathon, Ironmans, things like that? Why are you doing all that? And I partly was, I said, well, partly to manage my weight. And they're like, well, why don't you just not eat so much? Well, there's a thought. Oh, what? What do you mean?
That's an option?
Exactly. Oh, I didn't know that was an option. Exactly. Right. So, anyway, so I think because I've been looking into and doing some intermittent fasting and therapeutic fasting in this last 6 months to a year, but I actually had this thought myself the other day, like, what? Why am I doing this? Like, what's my intention here? Is this just the eating disorder showing another face in the name of health? Right. So I think
Yeah.
it's an interesting question. I think it's going to be differ for everybody, but I think the key word you used is control. Control is a big word with eating disorders.
So you've kind of mentioned that there's usually an underlying trigger or cause for an eating disorder to rear its ugly head, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the common kind of triggers or underlying causes that lead to these need for control?
hmm So I want the listeners to understand that, there's four aspects to us as people basically: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And there are some while there can be sort of common traits that we put on people who suffer from eating disorders, there's also differentiating traits that, because we're not all the same, right? We're not all carbon copies of each other. So while four children can all grow up in the same home, each can have a completely different experience of their childhood, because of it's all about how we process and interpret events in our minds that ultimately feeds our insecurities, which then feeds into these mental health challenges like eating disorders. So I would say the commonality is this word trauma, and perhaps the insecurities that get planted in these really important times in our lives as we're growing up. Because we want to understand, and this might not sound the greatest, but basically we're all programmed, not intentionally, like it's, but we're all programmed by the people who raise us. So what I mean by that is you absorb the environment that you're in, and your children are absorbing the environment that they're being raised in. So everything you see, everything that you, as a parent, everything that you do, everything you say, your child is picking up on that. And so I think this is a big piece of what plays into eating disorders. It's sort of this nature versus nurture argument that often we come back to in health. So the main common theme I'm going to say that runs across eating disorders is low self-esteem, low self-confidence, and potentially some sort of trauma, and the messaging that you receive in childhood. And then we'll just throw in that first one we already talked about, which is the media.
Okay, yeah, that all makes sense. So if trauma's a big trigger, I know that can also be the case for a lot of other mental health issues.
Mhm.
Does that then mean that often, similar to your situation, people will present with more than one form of mental illness? They'll kind of layer on top of each other?
I think so, yeah, for sure. Um, so one of my teachers is Gabor Mate, and he's a medical doctor that's recently created this, like, it's called compassionate inquiry. It's a psychotherapeutic technique, and I finished his program a couple months ago. It's a year-long training, and anyway, he's really big into mental health, mostly addictions, but also looking at yeah, depression, anxiety, eating disorder, whatever label we want to use. He thinks that the root cause of all of it is trauma. And I have to say, I pretty, I agree with him. He says that virtually everything that happens to you in childhood um, is can set you up for these predispositions to these mental health conditions, which are on the rise, right? They're all on the
Yeah.
rise.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I think as adults too, when we hear the word trauma, we think some sort of big, colossal type event, right? So something major. You've watched a car accident or you've gone to war or, big
yeah,
things like that, right? Or even like abuse, that sort of stuff. That's really a major
big T
event
trauma.
in someone's life. But trauma doesn't have to be something that grandiose, right? It can be some smaller things as well. Even things like dismissing a child when they're trying to talk or, saying like, oh, well, that doesn't matter. Like little things
Yeah,
like that, that if you get that small messaging frequently enough, that can be traumatic to a child because of the way they process the earth, right? And they're processing their environment and they're absorbing everything. And they don't have the same capacity as adults do to process and analyze and maybe to some degree compartmentalize, going, okay, well, this person's angry right now, so they're saying it this way, but really what they're trying to get across is this, right? But as a child, they don't have that same ability to really try and put themselves in the other person's shoes to better understand what those words truly meant and read between the lines.
yeah, exactly. So there's big T trauma, right? Those things that you listed, but then there's the little T traumas, right? And all these little T things add up. So if we look at me, here's a really kind of an interesting story. So Dr. Gabor Mate, I spoke with him recently to be interviewed for his new book called The Myths of the myth of normal, I think is what it's called. The subtitle is Finding Sanity in an Insane Culture. And he asked me, of all the physicians that I have seen over, my almost, 55 years on the planet, who ever asked me if I had trauma? And I said, nobody, nobody. And he said, so, let's talk about that. So we talked about it. And then he said, so, and I said to him, well, I don't really resonate with this word trauma. I said, sure, I was bullied for sure. Grade 3, yeah, I had some bullying. I had this. He said, okay, well, but aren't you adopted, Chris? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, don't you think that's a trauma? And I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess it is. It is, but I never looked at it as a trauma. One quote that resonates with me very deeply about adoption is that so adoption is the only trauma where you're expected to be grateful. So because of that, I never looked at my adoption or being adopted as a trauma, because I'm supposed to, I was grateful that I was adopted, but it's a trauma nonetheless, right? And
Yeah.
the way I learned about being adopted also was a trauma. And so what happens to children, and this is the thing, and I talk about this in my book, we as adults, we say something to a child, but we don't know if they interpret it or understand the words that we've used. So when my parents told me I was adopted at 5, I processed that to mean in my little brain that I was with them temporarily. So,
Okay.
okay, so then I also formed some beliefs. Of course, this isn't all conscious. This isn't done on a conscious level. I'm only 5, but I interpreted it to mean, in a sense, that, and this is how it sort of played out in my life, that I wasn't wanted, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, all that kind of line of limiting belief thinking. And so then what I did with that is I overcompensated and became a people-pleasing perfectionist that, is gonna I was that kid, right? I'm the top athlete, top student, and I was basically killing myself in the process because striving for perfection is an unrealistic ideal, right? And
Yeah.
eventually you're going to burn out. And I did burn out, and they called that depression, right? So it's super interesting, I think, to look at this trauma piece. The other thing I want to say about this trauma thing is it's not about what happens to you, okay? It's not the event. A lot of people think it's the event. It's not about the event. It's what happens inside of you, i.e., the beliefs you form as a result of the experience that you've gone through. That's the trauma.
Yeah, that's actually super thought-provoking for me and really interesting. My daughter's actually, well, I've adopted her. She is my husband's daughter, but I've adopted her. And so I made sure, like, even from when she was really little, we made sure it was part of normal conversation. Like it was never a secret, because I've always been of the thought that if you find out when you're like 18, it's going to be
Yeah.
life altering and shattering and totally traumatic, right? But it's interesting to think of it as like, even when you're little and the way you kind of process because you don't fully understand,
Hmm.
that can also really change your frame of mind, right? Or how you understand it. So I think
Yeah.
that's super interesting that in particular, because it's true. We don't think of that as a trauma. We're like, it's a positive event, right? It's like they found a
Hmm.
family that cares about them and we love them. And, this child has a great home life and whatever, because more than likely, if they've been adopted, they do have a better life than they did if they were not adopted, right? At least we assume as much. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, it is interesting to think that people expect you to be grateful for this thing that really you are trying to then piece together your identity and stuff too. I've also heard people talk about the fact that they're maybe mixed race and how that affects how they find their place in society, right? Because they've got these different cultures they need to melt
Mm.
together or blend in some way to identify who they are and how that's affected their growth. So I could see even something like that maybe being considered a little T trauma for certain people.
I think, yeah, the key thing is to understand is the delivery of the message or the information, and then to really make sure that the child feels safe and secure. So, there's two, Dr. Maté talks about, attachment, the differentiation between attachment and authenticity. As children, we want to be authentic, express who we are and our emotions and our states authentically. But we have to sometimes and often sacrifice our authenticity to maintain the attachment with the caregiver. And this is what feeds into this idea of trauma, because if we're being, say, for example, in a very serious situation of abuse, if we're being abused as a child, it's not safe for us to be authentic, right? Because it threatens our attachment, and attachment is the priority in our development as human beings, as young organisms, infants, children. So I find it interesting now that it's much more, I think, again, things change, right? Over since I've been born, things, we learn and we grow and we do things differently. And one of the things I think that's being handled better with adoption now is this concept of open adoption, if people are indeed open to that idea. I saw this episode on Oprah one time, and this little boy had an open adoption, and he was chatting with this other little kid in the play at the playground. He's about 7, I think, and the boy says to his friend that he tells him he was adopted, and the other boy thought that was sort of felt sad for him. Oh, that's sort of too bad almost, right? And this boy, his response was brilliant. He's like, no, it's amazing. I love it. I've got 2 parents, basically. I've got this family that loves me, and I have my biological mother who's involved in my life. And it was to me, it was eye-opening, right? It was like, wow, that's such a great way to present it to children. So
Yeah.
anyway, I know we're kind of moving off topic, but it's important because it feeds back into the eating disorder piece and this idea of trauma.
So I think this is a great spot to pause the conversation, since you'll be coming back again next week to continue chatting about eating disorders and some of the underlying causes. So far today, I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and I look forward to continuing this with you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of Supplementing Health, and I hope you tune in next week to catch the second half of today's conversation. Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic, or email us at marketing@aor.ca.